when I met you and we trained, first we started off with squatting. It was just you were talking to us and you were like, well, let's get into a squatting position. This is one of the best ways to open up the hips. It's like a precursor to what we're getting into. We practice jumping, falling, tumbling, partner tasks. Like I remember we'd draw a line in the sand and we'd have to stand on it like it was a balance beam and hold the partner's hand and try and pull them off balance. There was a lot of tree climbing, which was probably my favorite part. Tree climbing, very smooth movement through the tree climbs, and then also jumping from branch to branch. And then it all culminated in wrestling in the sand, which was where my favorite part was. I got choked out by this guy who was into BJJ. I forget his name, but you and I ended up crashing at his place that night, listening to music and crashing at his place. Do you remember who that was?
It must have been Rodrigo Fernandez, I think.
Yeah. He was great. But the reason why I bring all this up is by the end of it, not only was my ass whooped and in a very, very good way, but I felt so alive. I felt tired, but super alive. I felt like I engaged parts of my body. And you'll hear this a lot with like, man, I worked out muscles I forgot that I even had, or I never knew I had. That's what I was feeling. I felt like something had awoken inside me that wasn't just physiological. Like there was a brand new dormant, energy that was swirling around inside me. And that was when I really understood, really the deeper meaning that you were talking about inside movement, the deeper purpose of it. And we kind of touched base on that. And I want to get into like deep diving into the meaning of movement. But what I would really like is while we're talking about the different types of tasks you bring people through, I would like you to maybe go a little bit deeper and share with people like, okay, this that you did, Ben, was this kind of a workshop. And then I also have the return to source. Tell people what it is that you bring people into, and maybe just some of the philosophy and the meaning behind why you take people through the very specific types of movement in the specific places that you bring them as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, you participate in a 2-day seminar, which we don't offer currently. We only offer our residential retreats right now, or an online academy. And the method has developed quite a bit. There's a lot of layers that have been added to it since then. But the fundamental idea in the beginning was that the human being evolved to move, and that we evolved to learn movement through play. And then what are the fundamental forms of play that we find everywhere in the world? And those in the play research, they're referred to as locomotor play, object-oriented play, and rough and tumble play. So we figured that parkour, which I've been doing, I've been doing that for 16 years now. So I guess 11 years when I saw you, was basically the most kind of the closest to the source of human locomotor movement of any of the kind of primary movement disciplines that are out there, like more so than gymnastics or calisthenics or anything else. Like parkour really reflects how you solve movement problems to move yourself through your environment. That's what it's about. But we wanted to take it into nature. And I'd been doing that for several years within my parkour practice before I started Evolve Move Play. So we did that. And then I picked up a variety of games that involve playing with sticks and balls and objects and, throwing things around. And I'd done weightlifting for years. So I, maybe taught bits of that in the beginning. And then like we talked about, I had this extensive background in roughhousing, and I had actually been training martial arts since I was 6 years old. So I did Kung Fu, Aikido, I started with Tang Sudo, and then some Aikido, and then some Kung Fu in my younger childhood. So between 6 and 12. Then I took a few years off, and then at 15, we discovered Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Muay Thai through the early UFCs. And we found this Army Ranger who was training us out of his shed, me and my older brother and our friends. My older brother went and competed with the Gracies when he was in his teens, which was really cool. Yeah. So I had that background and kind of brought all those things together. And the fundamental, one of the ways that I've started to think about this over the years is that basically these are the whole foods of movement, and that our culture has fallen into this trap of reductionism and kind of nutrientism, where we think that we can, just like we think that we can fortify, just like we used to believe that we could fortify white bread with 14 minerals and vitamins and it'd be healthy, right? Wonder bread. We think that we can make a healthy human being through giving them cardio and stretching and isolated bodybuilding exercises.
Right.
Humans don't enjoy that, and it doesn't work very well for 9 out of 10 people. So we said, well, what are the whole foods of human movement? How do I get that movement diet right? And that's fundamentally what we're trying to share with people at those 2-day experiences. So the first ever Evolve Move Play event that we did, actually, though, was just event Return to the Source. So I made a video for Prana back in the day called Return to the Source through Parkour Visions. And it was just about my belief that the movements in parkour really have their origin in our relationship to the natural world. And so I was driven to go express parkour in nature. So that was the return to the source, returning to nature as the source of parkour. And so I just wanted to do a residential retreat for the parkour community, which took people into nature. And we were trying to figure out a name for it. So we called it Return to the Source. So we invited people up, and my dad happened to have a piece of land, 12 acres out in the woods. And I was like, well, we can just have people camp out there and we'll go out to all these cool natural spots and people will like it. So I'd been developing the ideas behind Evolve Move Play kind of in the background of my work in the parkour community in preparation for just in the background. But around the time that, like, after we launched Return to the Source, there was a crisis in the business, and I ended up walking away and deciding to start Evolve Move Play. So I approached everyone who'd signed up for Return to the Source that year and said, hey, is it okay if we take on this broader natural movement scope? And everyone was like, yeah, sure, let's do it. So that's the first time that I had incorporated the playful martial arts with the throwing, carrying stuff and the the parkour in nature. And we, of course, had campfires and we took saunas and we had food together, and something happened that was really special. And so we did it again the next year. And every year it kind of layered up these new things that would happen. And like, I think it was in 2016, we had a couple capoeiristas who came, who really were musicians and led us in songs. And it was like, okay, something else is happening here. And every year I would ask my students, like, well, how'd you like the event? And they was always like, this is the best event that I've ever been to. It's amazing. And then I'd ask them why, what they got out of it. And I always expected it to be like a jump that they did, or at least I initially expected that, right? I always expected it to kind of be about the movement or the concepts that I had shared with them. Ultimately, I think the purpose of a movement practice is to live a more meaningful life, to unlock more meaningful experiences. That's what I said. It's amazing. That quote, that podcast doesn't even exist anymore. But that quote has shown up, and like, I'll see like yoga teachers quoting me and probably don't know anything about me, but it shows the purpose of a movement practice is to unlock more meaningful experiences. So that I'm pretty sure that preceded me encountering Jordan Peterson, whose work's obviously about meaning. But I had this experience also that, I did a ton of scientific research, and I would share that scientific research in my seminars, and it impressed the students and it was valuable to some degree. But when I could connect them deeply to a story that was personal about struggles I'd had with ADHD, or, things that I learned in my relationship with my wife and how those were played out through rough and tumble play, that always hit harder, right? You could really see that it impacted people in a different way. And so I was trying to understand narrative better and how narrative impacted people. And so when Jordan Peterson did his first interview on the Joe Rogan podcast, like, the political side of it was interesting to me, but it really was when he got into all the archetypes and the structure of narrative and his theory of being that I was like, oh my God, okay, now this is blowing my mind. So I spent all of like the winter of 2016, 2017, like watching his lectures. And I went out to teach for the first time in that year in March of 2017 in LA, and And I had been like really confused about why I was spending so much time on those lectures instead of stuff that seemed more relevant to what I was doing. But when I started teaching, I found that like all the scientific research that I had about movement and about the evolutionary history of movement and my own stories, stuff that I didn't even like explicitly remember that I would talk about at seminars, but that came out when I was at a seminar, it all just sort of started to meld. And I realized that the project that Peterson was after, which is, helping people live a more meaningful life, it basically was perfectly aligned with what I was doing, just at different levels, right? And then I met, so then my friend John Vervaeke in 2018, I think he started releasing a series of lectures called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. So John was in the same department as Peterson at the University of Toronto, but he's also now the director of their cognitive science department. And he and Peterson basically were like always 1 and 2 and the most life-changing professors at U of T. So I reached out to John as soon as he started really putting these out, and I asked him for an interview, and I went and like read all of his scientific research in preparation for the interview. And so we became friends and have really communicated a lot about this. But yeah, I've come to fundamentally believe through all those experiences that the thing that keeps people going in a movement practice is ultimately the meaning that they get out of it. And all that we achieve physically, it's important and it's powerful and it can be really meaningful, but it's ephemeral, right? It's like you can break the world record today and maybe it'll last a year, maybe it'll last 10 years, but you're probably never going to run that fast again. Right? And I was lucky enough to be the first guy to accomplish a lot of kind of physical feats in the parkour community in Washington, but they're all someone else is going to do them all. And then eventually maybe some 13-year-old's going to do them. Like I had a student who, I'm pretty good parkour athlete, right? And I'd worked for years on this, and I worked up, it took me a year to get this swing between 2 branches. And then I took one of my students there who was 11 years old, and he did it his first try.
Oh my God.
And I was like, okay, well, it's all just, it's all going away, right? So what is it for? It's for how it transforms you as a person. So then you start to ask the question, well, what are you transforming towards? And what is this, right? What makes something meaningful? So through Peterson, we started talking about the idea of the heroic self, like the pursuit of the heroic self. And that's a powerful part of it. But there's maybe a more immediate way to look at it, which is it's about connecting to the things that mean the most, right? And those are basically the fundamental connections I've come to realize are the connections internal to the self, the body, the mind, the different aspects of the body, the different aspects of the mind, right? The emotional, cognitive, psychological, spiritual, right? I hesitate to use that word, and I use it a little bit differently than people, but it's important, right? All those things have to be integrated within the self. And for a lot of people, we're not integrated. So those connections, how do we reinforce those connections? And then how do we reinforce the connections between us and the world around us? How do we feel better connected and more deeply attuned to the world, and specifically the natural world? Because that's what we evolved for, and that's what we find most nourishing. And then how do we attune better and connect better to, and navigate better through the social, relational, physical world of other organisms, right? Other human beings. So that's the 3 fundamental things. And we found that there are 4 fundamental forms of practice, right? That give meaning to life. Those are practices of movement, practices of mindfulness, practices of nature connection, and practices of community. Those we think are really the most fundamental. And we think that movement is actually the most fundamental piece. And we think that it's something that's really misunderstood in the West, because movement is the only place in which the spiritual, psychological, cognitive, emotional, and physical can all be integrated, right? And we're getting development across all of them. And yet we have completely sort of denatured our movement practices of all the other levels, right? They're only about this physical expression. And then the ones that are about the more developmental side are often very divorced from reality. So we think we can do a lot better job of kind of uniting what's called Do in the Japanese martial arts, the way, and the Jitsu, the technical, right? And so we have the 4 pillars: movement, mindfulness, nature, connection, community. and our week-long events, they allow people to dive really deeply. And so with the set of practices that we offer, a lot of it, again, is around the movement practice. But so we'll have people do a movement practice, and then we'll add in the mindfulness piece, and we'll add in the movement, the community piece, by having them dialogue about the insights that they got from it. And then by sitting down after, so much movement material has been shared, and having and circling and describing the experiences and what we're getting out of it, and what's coming up for people. And sometimes really intense emotional stuff is coming up for people. And we use that as a place where people can be brave and safe and grow through that experience. And then we have storytelling around the campfire, and we play music, and we have saunas, and we do all these things that do that. And we also teach nature connection. We do fire making and tracking and picking wild foods, and learning about the local ecology, right? For us, a tree isn't just something green in the woods. It's a potential opportunity for movement. And that gives you an insight into how a tree is meaningful in a way deeper way than someone else might have. But then once you realize that a tree can be meaningful because it allows you to vault and jump and swing, you could also realize that it's meaningful because it's a source of fruits and nuts that you could eat, or it's a source of fibers from which you can make cords and baskets, or it's a source of lumber and firewood, or it's where you can find birds' eggs, or how do the wildlife in the area utilize that tree, and so it becomes layered with these deeper and deeper levels of meaning, and we want to help people recognize that and help people come into this deeper sense of relationship to those most fundamental connections, and through that to craft more virtuous human beings who are capable of being the best problem solvers they can to serve the highest good.
Make sure y'all head over to benjosephstewart.com, become a member. You'll have access to the growing library of deeper dives where I talk about all the stuff that I really can't talk about on YouTube. Make sure you get involved in the Discord chat. That's where a lot of the conversation is happening, talking about new theories, being able to interweave into the greater conversation that is how we awaken infinity. That's our highest potential. And I just want to remind you, you are the most powerful technology ever known to creation. Wield it like an artist with a conscience.